Welcome. Welcome to Althusser Study Group. It's so nice to have everybody back on board. So tonight we're actually looking at, I think, one of Althusser's cleverest, sort of most sort of well-argued papers, especially regarding, I mean, it's so contradiction and overdetermination. What is the sort of heart of this piece? There's many ways, I think, to get at what is going on here. It comes about, I think, in 1963, so it's pre the Cultural Revolution. It is certainly in the era of de-Stalinization. And what we have here is a sort of confrontation about the future of Marxist practice and the extent and the place of Hegel. And where does Hegel fit within Marxism? There's been two sort of major overhauls of what you could say sort of extracting or sort of removing Hegel from Marx, first with Lenin and second with Mao. And I want to talk a little bit about Lenin because Lenin becomes the main sort of focal point, and Lenin becomes the main focal point in an interesting way for us, especially after our study of Lacerdo's class struggle text, precisely because I want to suggest that there's a kind of curious operation at work in the very notion of what a contradiction is for Hegel, right? Both for Lacerdo, for Marx, as well as for Althusser. So initially, in Marx and in his break with Hegel, there is a conception about to what extent are we going to overhaul the Hegelian mystified shell to retain, famously the rational kernel inside of it. So what we know is that Marx insists upon a rational Hegel. The question is, what type of rational Hegel is being retained? And here, Mao, Lenin, Althusser all give different accounts. And Engels, importantly, is a huge casts a huge shadow in this debate, right? Why? Well, I guess because you could consider Engels to be the one that insists upon a type of incorporation of Hegel as what I would call, in my own framework, my own understanding, a kind of imminent socialized application of the entirety of the Hegelian apparatus of the main concepts of the dialectic, from sublation or supersession, of the negation, right? Of the transition from quantity into quality. Engels retains all of this and puts forward the notion that it can be retained and applied to the class struggle, right? As does Lukács, right? So Lukács follows Engels to the letter in a very sort of doctrinaire way, insisting upon this kind of Marxized or socialized version of Hegel, who basically doesn't need much modification other than being inverted or turned right side up, right? In the first or second footnote in the essay, there is an interesting contrast that I pointed out between the way that Lukács translates this passage from Marx's, I guess it was a forward to the second volume of Capital, where Marx makes this reference to turning Hegel right side up. I'm not going to get into the exegesis, but I'm just going to say that there's an interesting contrast here, precisely in the sense that Althusser chooses a translation that removes the sense that the dialectic would be used by a sort of we or by a kind of plural subject. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is that in the first section of this essay, Althusser is saying very strongly that, the basic structure of the Hegelian dialectic is so radically transformed that even to retain the rational kernel, Marx recognizes that it's actually not feasible. There is what Althusser calls, and we saw this last time, a pre-dialectical operation that has to be thought. And I think what that indicates is, and he's emphasizing and he's stressing a lot that in reality, this is an unfinished project of Marxism, of Marxist philosophy, and that it is sort of like a task for Marxist thinkers to follow Marx's premonition that Hegel has to be transcended. So then the question is this sort of, okay, well, how do we transcend Hegel? And Althusser basically says that it starts with Engels's false idea that we can separate Hegel between what Engels calls his method and his system, right? So his method is like understood to be sort of like the ground by which the Hegelian conception of the idea itself emanates from. And for Althusser, this is famously, which been talking about in the Discord, is sort of mired within a problematic of the 18th century. So I feel like, as we discussed last time, this notion of what is Hegel's problematic cannot be escaped. And Althusser wishes to say that Marx recognized that it couldn't be escaped. And this idea, therefore, is that a Hegelian conception of contradiction, okay, will itself be caught within a humanist problematic. It will be caught within a kind of 18th century bourgeois conception of the individual. And he gives a number of examples of the inadequacy of Hegel's own conception of contradiction, inadequate for fully thinking the split within social life that Hegel applied dialectics to, which was the split between civil society and the state. And Althusser reads Hegel in this regard, I think, very much as kind of the real is actual, this kind of conservative notion. He reads Hegel as basically suggesting that the state is the truth of civil society. So he does not read Hegel in a kind of immanent way. And I'm thinking here of the sort of groundbreaking way of reading Hegel that we find, say, in Lukács, in the Young Hegel, where such a kind of sort of arrived at conservative Hegel is not necessarily the only way to read Hegel. So I'd be very curious to see what people think about that. But yes, the basic idea is that Engels' distinction between the method and the system of Hegel is not adequate, right? It's basically, he says it is impossible that we can conceive of Hegel's dialectic as a kernel in a nut, right? It is enough that it be freed from its first wrapping, the system. It is not enough that it be freed from its first wrapping, the system. It must be freed from its second mystical wrapping, which is its method itself. So what I have the sense here is that there is a sort of a total operation of a kind of excision of Hegel. And the first question that I have for you all is like, what are the costs of that? What is lost for Marx's practice in that? Now, that's just the opening few points. We can return to that. Let me say a few things about the second section of the essay, and then we'll open it to Conrad. So basically, he begins with this notion of the Russian Revolution and the discovery on behalf of Lenin of the notion of the weakest link, which is sort of why was it that Russia took off in 1917? And the basic notion is that the social field was sort of riddled with a multiplicity of contradictions, primarily, but not exclusively, caused from uneven capitalist development, which made Russia the weakest link and therefore primed for revolutionary activity. But moreover, Althusser wishes to suggest that Lenin sort of gives us a sort of grammar by which we can read a social situation as primed or not primed for revolutionary agitation, right? Based on our reading of the immanent field of contradictions themselves. So immediately what we have here is also a very important question, which is the status of what is the Marxist intellectual's task. And I find it very interesting that Gramsci, as Kolia has mentioned last time, is invoked precisely in this way, but invoked in a negative sense. I mean, Kolia mentioned that Althusser is working with Gramsci, but he's also, while he's recognizing the necessity of a conjunctural analysis, and that is part of the reason why the theory of contradiction must be thought by the Marxist intellectual. Did you notice in the footnote on Gramsci, which I believe happens on page 99 or 100, did you notice that Althusser says that we reject the Gramscian theory of the organic intellectual precisely because it's too general? And that kind of goes back to Aliyah's point, right? About this notion of the merger thesis and the distinction between worker and intellectual in Marxism, because Althusser puts forward a completely different conception of how an intellectual is to assess. Now, let me add one thing from our work on Losurdo, which is that in Losurdo's conception of multiplicity of struggles, which you probably all remember, notice that Marx, one of the claims that Losurdo makes and that Althusser also makes, is that Marx recognizes that bourgeois society gives us a kind of overly simple, reductive contradiction between labor and capital, or between proletariat and bourgeoisie, but that within the multiplicity of the class struggle, that contradiction cannot be arrived at within the class struggle itself. In other words, the class struggle does not immediately lend itself to the appearance of this easy binary. Remember Losurdo's point about every time Marx and Engels insist upon the binary nature of the class struggle, what becomes the problem? Chauvinism. It's almost an ethical problem. It's almost an ethical problem, right? What does Althusser say that it becomes? Well, he says that it becomes a problem, and here he's referencing Stalin, precisely in that it lends itself to a moralism of a mechanistic and deterministic conception of the class struggle, as if the intellectual could reasonably depend upon a binary conception of the class struggle and sort of wash their hands of it. No, it doesn't work that way, right? We have a multiplicity of the class struggle. We have this notion that contradictions are themselves not neat binary constructs, but they are in fact overdetermined. And I'm sure Conrad will say a lot more about this notion of overdetermination, right? But ultimately, what the problem becomes is that the Hegelian conception of contradiction is humanist. He says on page 103 that it is humanist. It ultimately, and I found this very curious and very interesting, precisely because I'm reading Estevan Mezaros, who's a great scholar of Lukács in his book Beyond Capital, who gives a criticism of Lukács, precisely saying that Lukács tried to out-Hegel Hegel by conceiving of the task of the standpoint of the proletariat as this, kind of unity of the subject-object division, right? What does Mezaros say about the downside of that? Well, in a certain sense, he says that it ended up leading to a type of, not chauvinism, but he said that it led to a crisis of the relationship between the party and their mediation to the working class that effectively rendered the party incapable of fully representing, of fully achieving that subject-object division, of fully, subsuming the collective interests of the class. You know, that division that Lenin often talks about regarding how the party is to stand in for class. I mean, this is a huge debate, especially after 1917, especially after dictatorship of the proletariat is thrown onto the table. So that's something that we can discuss as well. This notion that the Hegelian that the mystified shell of the method, right, still has this contamination of a humanist imprint, and that this leads to a type of, um, well, what does he say on page 104? He says that, yeah, it's very interesting, by the way, because he doesn't exactly say Stalin too much, but I really feel that the kind of legacy of Stalin is haunting this notion of the accusation of humanism, which is very foreign to us to call Stalin a humanist. This is actually something that Conrad talks about in an essay for Flowers for Marx, a book that we're working on, and maybe he could say something more about that. Um, he says the task of a contradiction is, quote, the magical movement of the concrete contents of a historical epoch towards their ideological goal, right? So, in other words, the Hegelian conception is caught within a telos. It's caught within a telos of a people, right? And that it almost has a kind of unitary theory of contradiction that's latent within it. And so this is interesting to me precisely as a scholar of Lukács in the sense that, or even of Engels, because they are trying to make the inversion possible, but for the proletariat, right? And Althusser is muddying that entire wager. That entire conception is completely thrown out. Another thing we should obviously discuss is the 1890 letter um, that Engels wrote to a figure by the name of Bloch, which is a very important letter. Um, okay, so what is this letter? It's similar to the letter that we discussed last time from 1843 of Marx to Arnold Ruge. Similar, well, they're different, but similar insofar as they become, and this I think is good for all of you who are writing about Marx, the centrality of letters. I mean, keep in mind when Alain Badiou theorizes the theory of the communist hypothesis, do you know that he bases it off of a letter, primarily from a letter of Marx? So I love this uncanny capacity for this exegetical, or almost like philological strength that can be gleaned from the power of a letter. The letter in question here, let me just summarize it without reading it, is the notion of why did Marx and Engels choose to put an overemphasis on the economic base over that of the superstructure, nation, culture, etc. And the first thing that Engels says, while recognizing that they did do that and it was an error in some sense, what is the first thing he says that Althusser doesn't mention, which I think is very important? He says, well, of course, we did that because our enemies refused to ever do that themselves. It's like, the elephant in the room, which is a true conundrum for Marxism, because our enemies will not only will they not do that, but like they will have a kind of indifference to the economic determination, or what Althusser calls um, the last instance. Yeah. So that struck me as interesting. Frankly, there's a lot to be said about this, especially in the wake of Kaihi Saito's degrowth communism and all of this work on the kind of later Marx and the direction of his praxis that can be discussed here. And let me just say a couple final things. Um, so Gramsci says, when one does not have the initiative in the struggle, and the struggle itself is ultimately identified with a series of defeats, mechanical determinism becomes a formidable power of moral resistance, of cohesion, and patient, obstinate perseverance. This is extremely important. What is the key point here? In other words, when we don't have available to us the field that Lenin had available, what Badiou calls a precarious field, a pre-evental field, a pre-political field. When we're in that kind of interstitial place, Gramsci warns that Marxists fall into a kind of moral resistance. And this has to do with the way the intellectual conceives of contradictions. Okay. So this is essential. The simple contradiction between labor and capital is always overdetermined. Imperialism, the law of uneven development, the superstructure, right? All of these things um, basically have a sort of like appearance in some sense, uh, but depending upon the conjunctural situation of the class struggle, there can be two ways in which it generally can go. Althusser says one, it could go in the way of what he calls historical inhibition, which is basically that the contradictions are blocked from a productive realization in the class struggle, or they can have a kind of what he calls revolutionary rupture. And so, what's interesting to me is that what this comes down to, I think, in many ways, is sort of the didacticism, or as we talked about last time, the methodological repositioning of the intellectual in relationship to the field of class struggle itself. How is the intellectual to relate to the field of class struggle is what this essay brings out for me, right? And moreover, Althusser says it straight out, which is historical materialism has to be rethought in light of all of this, right? Are we going to think historical materialism from the enrapture, the model, what he calls the model of Hegel's dialectics, right? Because that model is split between a dualism, like I mentioned before, between a materialism and a spiritualism, state, civil society. Althusser then says, yes, that dualism is still present in Marx, but it's completely revised and completely overhauled. What does it look like now? It is the dualism between what Althusser calls forces and relations of production. They replace civil society. And then you have the state replaced by social classes. Okay. And what I think is very interesting here, and which again is not said, it's not said, because what's happening in the global communist movement at the time? Well, the dissolution of any international commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat itself, which again, I find curious that this is not even mentioned in this essay, right? Because this is exactly what's happening. I mean, it's no surprise that when the Cultural Revolution begins, what is Mao's instruction? His instruction is to conduct study groups on the meaning of dictatorship of the proletariat, precisely because it had been half a decade since it had been cogitated or even thought by Marxists, right? So here Althusser is trying to almost make a way around that, perhaps. I mean, it is no surprise that Balibar, one of Althusser's most important students, ends up writing the seminal post-Althusserian text on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Not too many, I guess in the early 70s, right? So we cannot remain within the dualism of Hegel. If we do, we miss the novelty of the epistemological break of historical materialism itself. We remain in a teleological, humanist, ultimately 18th century model of contradiction that cannot help us adequately think the multiplicity of contradictions. Okay. Notice also something that bothered me, but in an interesting way, and then I'll stop talking. Um, Lukács gets a footnote, and what is he accused of? He's accused of being a guilty Hegelian that attempted to use Hegel to overcome his neo-Kantian masters of, Weber and Simmel, um, which I didn't think was a an interesting point on Althusser's part, because again, um, contradiction, right? Contradiction for um, Lukács's understanding of Marx and Hegel, right, has to do with this field of like social political epistemology, right? It has to do with the conception of essence and appearance. It incorporates many of the systematic concepts of Hegel, including negation of the negation, and applies them in a rigorous, socially engaged way through a commitment to this sort of primary primary contradiction within social life in bourgeois society between labor and capital, and therefore primarily between two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. The fact that that contradiction is fetishized or reified, of course, goes without saying. The thing with Hegel is that Hegel gives us the epistemological uh, 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 tools to properly see that contradiction. So I do fear that Althusser is taking that away from us. That's my fear, okay? Let me just say one final thing about this notion of survivals. Maybe somebody could articulate this better than me, but he ends the essay by saying, um, well, after 1917, how is it possible that this great revolution allowed for Stalin's crimes? How are we to think this? Are we to think this as the kind of sunk inertia of different reactionary cultural forms that the revolution did not expunge? What he doesn't say, which I think he should have said, is that really this is the question of cultural revolution, right? Which, of course, split the Bolsheviks heavily. In other words, this is the question of, yes, the relationship between base and superstructure in the face of a revolution, but it's also something about the kind of strange inertia of the superstructure, right? There's a lot to this notion of the survivals. It also could be theorized vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. We could even bring in Freud and Lacan to understand this idea of how are we thinking a transformation of a libidinal transformation of the sunk repression of the proletariat. Because this, after all, was the heart of the Cultural Revolution theory and debates for the Bolsheviks, right? Which is how can proletarian education function not only to prime the proletariat for power, but for some kind of transformation in their collective social being, right? There's an ethical question that is going on here, okay? Let me say one other final thing, and then I'll turn it to Conrad. Remember, Losurdo says something very interesting about the meaning of overdetermined contradictions in Russia for Lenin, but he also says that Marx, and he gives a nice passage, I think it may even be from a letter right before Marx died, which is that imperialism and like this kind of overdetermination of contradictions will lead to what Marx calls the inevitability of social revolution. In other words, the exacerbation of the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production will not produce a single revolution, but will create the scene for what Marx calls a new era of social revolution. So that I found to be quite interesting, which is very much tied into this idea that Althusser is suggesting from Lenin and from Gramsci. Uh, when the class struggle is hot, when it is ripe, when we have an era of social revolutions and so on, which I don't think that we live in such an era, by the way. Uh, the task of the intellectual is much more transparent. It's very clear. I think our question is, what would be the task of the intellectual in the first scenario of what Althusser calls historical inhibition, right? And then with that, I will turn it over to Conrad.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. I feel that my bandwidth is perhaps a little bit overtaxed by the sheer volume of people here, so I hope that I will be both audible and visible to everyone here. So I'll just try to make a few comments. I feel like Daniel's done a pretty good job, laying out the broad strokes of this essay. So maybe what I'll attempt to do is to alert you to some of the nuances and sources of the text. So Daniel, in his discussion, he said that this is one of, in his words, the quote cleverest essays by Althusser. I feel that while that's likely true, it may also be an understatement. Contradiction and Overdetermination, alongside the essay on ISAs, is one of surely Althusser's two most famous essays. But unlike, for instance, the essay on ISAs, which I feel like, is very well known, but is in a sense an appendage of his larger system, I think this one is particularly important because, in a sense, what we find here is the nucleus, right, or the genesis, if you will, of the possibility of thinking what we could term Althusserianism, right? If you look at the last two essays, you can see that they still wear a kind of they're quite original, right? They're quite striking, several of them, but they still wear this kind of scholarly or exegetical veil, right? As if he's just talking about the young Marx, how do we... But here, I think it becomes very, very clear the sheer scope of his ambition, an ambition that is beginning to transcend, anything resembling, a purely descriptive sort of scholarship, right? Now, it's important, if we're talking about how innovative this text is, to talk about how is that innovation arrived at, right? What are the sources of this text? And I think that very often when people talk about this text, they're going to point to two significant influences in the formulations here. So one of these is Freud, right? And that is specifically the concept of overdetermination, which we find in Freud's interpretation of dreams. And in essence, in the interpretation of dreams, of course, I'm not a Freudian, but in essence, I understand that overdetermination is used to describe the way that you have all these sort of discontinuous elements, right? Various experiences during the day and so forth, that when you're dreaming, become compounded or synthesized in this kind of indeterminate way into the content of the dream. Maybe someone will correct me if that's not fully adequate. But on the other hand, we have another source, which I'm perhaps somewhat more authoritative in my ability to speak of, and that is the influence of Maoism on this essay. And of course, it's Mao's famous essay from 1937 on contradiction that really, I think in some sense, you can read, uh, contradiction over determination as an attempt to refine and elaborate in a more philosophical register Mao's approach in that essay. So that essay by Mao was written under a specific set of circumstances, right? The Japanese had invaded China, right? And China, in any case, was a nation that even more so than Lenin's Russia did not fit the archetype that we might imagine a state would have for a Marxist revolution to break out in terms of the simplification of labor and capital. But particularly under the circumstances in which Japan was, kind of existentially menacing China. Lasordo speaks about this, and I do think it's useful to bring in Lasordo often to Althusser as a point of reference. Lasordo talks about the way that, the goal was nothing less than a kind of stratified racial enslavement being imposed on China, right? So in this context, Mao is trying to theorize how we should think about social struggle. And in what amounts to his most perhaps decisive and famous philosophical gesture, if you will. He speaks of the need to differentiate between primary and secondary contradictions, right? And he talks about how it may be the case that under certain circumstances, the contradiction between bourgeoisie and proletariat will function as the primary contradiction, but there may be other circumstances in which that is effectively displaced, right? So while it may be the case globally and with respect to capitalism as a whole that bourgeoisie proletariat is decisive, when you're, for example, a semi-colonial nation confronting Japanese imperialism, it can be the case that the defense of the nation becomes the primary contradiction, right? And actually, if you look at this text, it's interesting because in a way, I talk about Freud, I talk about Mao, both of these influences are acknowledged, however schematically or passively, but they're acknowledged with an almost comical degree of distance, right? Considering how obviously central they are to the composition of the text. So I think with respect to Mao, it's a footnote, right? And Althusser says, well, Mao brings up, you know, something to this effect. But his work has the disadvantage, as it were, or just the character of being too schematic in the sense that it's presented as a kind of treatise on dialectics in general, right? Rather than the kind of, more argumentative and philosophical vein. Freud is not, I believe, ever explicitly mentioned. However, at some point, and it's quite funny, he says the concept of overdetermination brackets borrowed from another discipline, right? And that's all he says on that, right? Which is quite funny, right? But there is a reason for this, right? Which is that Althusser was publishing at this time in French Communist Party journals. And obviously they were, while things had opened up considerably from the situation a decade earlier, they were still fairly dogmatic in a lot of respects. And he did not want to seem to be transgressing too much, the sort of dominant ideological character of the party. And on a deeper level, and I think Daniel's touched on this, this arguably explains why you have this kind of straw man version of Hegel that gets introduced. Because while Althusser touches at the very end of the essay on the relationship of this problem to the larger oppressions of Stalinism, he does not want to holistically repudiate the doctrines of the PCF, which remain deeply embedded to dialectical materialism and so forth. So that's kind of offloaded, right, onto this image of Hegel, thinker of a purely kind of linear form of contradictory determination in that way. Now, I want to add as well, with respect to what Daniel said, it was interesting. Daniel was talking about the significance of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat to all of this, and he referenced a work by Etienne Balibar from 1976, Sur la dictature du prolétariat. And I want to add a little bit of context to that, because in fact, in the late 1970s, the French Communist Party actually goes to reject altogether the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is part of a larger shift into Eurocommunism, right? Into the idea that our goal is not to emulate a kind of socialist state or to achieve a revolution analogous to, say, Russia or China, but our goal is really to engage in a kind of state management as a parliamentary party and to mobilize a kind of populism in order to achieve that, right? And in the context of this debate, and I believe that this debate was the occasion for Etienne Balibar writing about it, both Althusser and Balibar kind of staged a comeback or a reunion of tour of sorts in order to oppose themselves to the idea that this should be rejected. And what they basically argued was that obviously, in the vocabulary or in the context of this debate, the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat was being yoked together with the concept of kind of totalitarian, this Arendtian kind of concept of totalitarian dictatorship, but that the term was not reducible to that, and that a failure to commit to it in a more emancipatory sense would be highly destructive for any kind of Marxism. And I think it's very interesting, by the way, with respect to that historical impasse, because in addition to the kind of Euro-communist turn, one thing we find uh, in the late 70s with the kind of populism that the PCF is trying to construct, it's something I think we see quite a lot of today on the left, which is the tendency to engage in a kind of knee-jerk rejection of a lot of the trends that were occurring at the time with respect to social liberalism, right? So at the kind of extreme end of the spectrum, right, we see this with, the ACP, right, where you often see these kind of members engaging in this kind of violent rejection of, the idea of like trans people, these are all just, woke libtards, blah. You know, and this in a way, and I should add that the embrace of this sort of positioning by the PCF, which we can see the echoes of today, even if we look at the current leadership, right, Fabien Roussel, the embrace of this kind of positioning by the PCF, in a sense, represents the death knell of the Althusserian project, right? Because the goal of the Althusserian project was to intervene into this context in which you had, humanism, you had the kind of nascent energies that were soon going to lead to, this explosion of social energies in May 1968, to intervene into it and to try to develop a really rigorous Marxist understanding of that, right? But ultimately, that project fails to achieve an ideological renovation of the PCF. And the result is, again, a kind of parliamentary populism coupled with this kind of reflexive hostility toward these sort of socially progressivist or liberal trends, if you will. So I just want to add a little bit of context on that. Now, with respect to the text itself, again, Daniel went through a lot of points, and I don't feel compelled to uh, go over all that again in with a fine-tooth comb. But I do think that it's important that we stress the relationship of this to history in general. So one of the old, classic, 18th Brumaire, one of the classic lines, right? First is tragedy, then is farce, right? And I think in a way, I may have said before, I think in a way that it's important to understand the degree to which the Russian Revolution, in spite of or because it was such an important break for Marxism, right, a real legitimation of it on the political stage, also represented a kind of trauma, right, to the Marxist tradition. And this had to do with the fact that it was so contrary, right, to the arc of history as it had been conceptualized and imagined, right, by earlier Marxist movements, in particular the German SPD, right, that it created this situation in which it threw a lot of things into theoretical doubt, right? The fact that a state that did not have this highly developed proletariat was the first one to accomplish revolution, the fact that in the wake of that, that did not become, as Lenin initially predicted, a spark, right, that would lead to larger and yet more decisive revolutions in the West, became, state communism, if you will. All of this was extremely disturbing to this sort of teleological hypothesis. But I want to say that if that was the theoretical tragedy, right, the farce, in a sense, was the Chinese Revolution, right, which rather than, as was initially projected with the idea of a kind of impending world revolution, rather than confirming some kind of teleological hypothesis, the Chinese Revolution, in fact, was, the next big revolution, right, would be the one in a state that was even less close, right? That was even less developed, right? With an even smaller proletariat, right? And I think this explains significantly Althusser's, ambivalence towards a figure like Lukács. How much Lukács he read in depth, I'm not sure. What would have been available in translation or what he would have read. But I think there's a real skepticism here about any approach to Marxism that is, as Daniel put it, that is trying to deploy a kind of Hegelian methodology, but to anchor it in the concept of the proletariat as a class for itself, right? I think he's much more engaged with trying to survey or develop a theory that accounts for, the realities of, these revolutions and this history, So of course, when he talks about Russia, he talks about, we had all these different contradictions going on at once, right? We had these sort of contradictions of colonialism that were in Russia. We had, the sort of feudal proprietors, who were diffusing ideology with the help of clerics. We have big bourgeoisie, and proletarian resistance, petty bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth, right? He refers to it as at the same time the most backward and the most advanced state, right? And such is the nature of this text when you read it that I think every time you read it, you're going to get something new. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of gears turning. And for me, one thing that I got that I thought was very interesting, um, new when I read it this time, was when he's talking about the simplification of contradiction. So he opposes the Russian Revolution, right, to the deterministic notion that was favored by the SPD, right, the simplification of contradiction in labor and capital, and that's going to lead to revolution. But one point he says that now on the surface of it, I want to say on the surface of it, this would seem like what he's saying is that it's more likely that perhaps in a country that's less developed, right, that we're going to have revolution. And that would be, in a sense, a vindication of some of the historical realities of Marxism. But at one point, when he's talking about this, he says, even if, right? I don't know the quote here exactly, but he basically says, even if the contradiction were simplified, that contradiction would still have to fuse into this kind of ruptural unity based on overdetermination. And I found that to be really, really striking because in a way, it problematizes and defies a simpler reading of the text, right? Which is, I think, can be quite intuitive, even if he doesn't exactly say it, which is that, we're likely to have more of these diffuse contradictions at a lower level of development, right? And what he seems to be suggesting is that even at a higher level of development, right, it could be the case that you could have a revolutionary impasse, but however that impasse might manifest, it could never be reducible to this kind of simplified teleology, right? And I think that's very, very significant. And it would be very, very significant for thinking about, and there's a great letter, I think Verso published it on his website. There's a great letter that Althusser wrote about May 68 and the events of May 68. And for Althusser, the real problem in a way with the popular reception of May 68 was the importance that people assigned to the students without really recognizing that it was the involvement of the proletariat that really made it a powerful movement. But I think thinking about this dilemma would be very interesting in terms of gauging his reception of 68 and the way that his work was taken up in that context. So yeah, so we have contradiction over determination. And then eventually, later on, of course, we pass into the this appendix, which I think is really worth paying attention to as well. And in the appendix, um, someone commented that he repeated Albit's Sach, which is definitely true there. But in the appendix, because if you look at the actual on contradiction over determination, one of the things that he does is he uses this idea of in the last instance, right? And this refers to the idea that, well, yes, we could say that there's a kind of economic determination going on in Marx, that's clear, but there will never be a moment at which, the economic manifests in its pure sense, in which the contradiction which is set on by the economic is going to be purely visible, right? Because in that sense, the only way that you could discern it is because of the influence that it exerts, right? On these different instances, right? On the superstructure. And yet those will always have their kind of specific effectivity, right? In other words, the presence of economic determination will never diffuse, right, or erase the specificity of those instances, right? And I think, by the way, it's a famous quote, right? The lonely hour of the last instance never comes, right? Beautiful quote. Great writer. Um, but I think that, one of the obvious problems that this raises is if the lonely hour of the last instance never comes, how do we know it's even there? And this is going to be a really significant factor in the receptions to Althusser, because it would probably be not too much of a stretch to suggest that if you look at someone like Foucault, right, that a lot of what he's doing at times is taking up Althusser's method, but stripping it, right, of, this sort of residual mark methodology, if you will. I think much the same could be said in a different way of Laclau and Mouffe, right, with their sort of conception of hegemony and post-Marxism, and the need to build this kind of unity of social struggles and all of that without assigning a particular primacy to the proletariat. But I wanted to talk about the appendix, and I think the appendix is very significant because he returns to the letter from Engels to Bloch, from which he extracted this conception of determination in the last instance. And he talks about Engels' sort of exposition and why he didn't draw on other elements of Engels' exposition, why he, had recourse primarily to this idea of determination in the last instance. And we find that what he basically says in the first, he talks about how the letter kind of switches its mode of explanation. So in the first part, we have this idea of, the economic determination is explicable with respect to the relationship between a substance and or necessity and accidents, right? But he also kind of points out that this turns out to be difficult in the sense that, or troubled in the sense that there's no actual explanation given of why one side of this equation would be necessity and the other one would be accident. So why the superstructure is just an accident, right, in relation to the field of economic necessity. And in the second one, he passes into another mode of explanation that Engels employs, and that's to Engels talks about how you have all of these individual wills and how they all want different things, but how when they kind of, converge, that this creates the historical event out of this. And Althusser observes that this is very much like an 18th century bourgeois mode of thinking, right? If you think of, I think most famously for an English-speaking audience, if you think of the invisible hand in Smith, right? The idea that you have all these different individuated economic wills that then, conspire to support the public good, right? But we also see it, and actually, Dan mentioned the young Hegel, right? Lukács argues in the young Hegel that the ruse of reason, right? The idea that, you have these isolated instances within history that may seem contingent, but they're all kind of conspiring to generate this larger result. In fact, I believe Lukács argues that that's actually influenced by Adam Smith, because part of his argument in the young Hegel is that Hegel was, far more familiar with classical political economy and far more influenced by it than we typically give him credit for. So Althusser refers this metaphor to its kind of 18th century source. But what he points out is that, you can never extrapolate the truth of something from the infinity of its kind of extrinsic manifestations, right? Or maybe to put that another way, and maybe a better way to explain this, he directs us to Rousseau at one point here with respect to this idea of the individual wills. And he refers to this idea within Rousseau that, because in Rousseau we have the general will, right? And he refers to this idea that all of the particular wills in Rousseau's writing converge and they become a general will, right? And the problem here that Althusser has is, like, what is the content of the general will, if that's the case, right? All the particular wills just become a general will, right? They're all equally represented, right? In the general will, is that it? So Althusser actually gave lectures on Rousseau in the mid-60s, and Alberto Toscano talks about this great essay. He writes about it in his newish book, Terms of Disorder. Althusser gave lectures on Rousseau in the mid-60s, and what Althusser argues is that by not elaborating how the transition from the particular will to the general will might function, what the ideological character of the general will would be, that Rousseau contributes to an obfuscation of the character of bourgeois rule, right? That in a sense, Rousseau does not want to say what this is, right? Because his work is connected to this shift manifest in the French Revolution, in which the bourgeois would achieve predominance, right? And that it will never be the case. Like a certain regime is always going to want to present itself, right, as representing all of society, right? But of course, this is very contrary, right, to a Marxist analysis, right, which focuses on social classes and all of this. So we see this, you know, I'm not sure the exact year of these lectures, mid 60s, but we see this idea here, right, by the same token, that this metaphor of the individual wills would be inadequate because it's not as if we can just look at the infinity of superstructural instances, you know, and then extrapolate the substance or functioning of the base from that, right? So that's all I wanted to say about that. Maybe we can open up for
Beautiful.
questions now.
Brilliant. This is amazing. Thank you so much. Uh, so Andrew's got a comment or question. Just want to say one quick thing before Andrew goes up, which is I just wanted to reiterate a point that Conrad hit upon, um, which is this idea that I mentioned it as well of sort of what is the sort of the means by which we as Marxists discern revolutionary potential or the possibility of revolutionary rupture when Althusser takes it as a kind of fact of history, that a binary contradiction, that the contradiction which we take to be primary is not the site of history. He says, rather, history moves on its bad side. And I'm sorry to tell you, but I felt that the master slave dialectic of Hegel is introduced here in some sense. Uh, well, it's the labor of the slave, is it not? And it is very curious. I wonder what you all think. That Loserdo, what does he chastise Althusser for? Precisely for abandoning the dialectics of recognition, right? Why would he abandon the dialectics of recognition? Because the dialectics of recognition relies upon a Hegel of consciousness. And the Hegel of consciousness, as he demonstrates here, cannot think ruptural. It does. It relies on a kind of preservation model. Sublation does not sublate when you have Hegel, is one way to say it. I know that's very abstract, but Andrew, hop in.
Oh yeah, you're raising a lot, especially with Hegel. Now, I'm not a Hegel scholar, but like just the fact of sublation doesn't fully like supersede or preserve that. There's always a remainder left out. Not to sound Zizekian, but like even if you read the logic when he talks about being and determinants, there's some determinants and qualities of being that kind of like rupture the totality. But no, that's not like my comment. I have a simple question. I'll try to make it simple because it seemed like in the last two I've kind of had some convoluted ones. But I mean, if this goes out to like both you, Daniel, and Conrad. This notion of overdetermination, and as Conrad mentioned, the influence of Freud, and I think Conrad, you kind of like represented the notion of the dream work quite well, because I mean, not to psychoanalytically over like analyze this text, but if we take this notion of overdetermination seriously, as he says, as Althusser says, it seems like it's tied in with like this weakest link. And what my question regards or it brings up is this question concerning regression, because what does Freud say about the dream and overdetermination, but that it's not only something that could condense a multiplicity of contradictions or thoughts into one dream thought or dream image, or displace, right, his Vorstellung Repräsentanz, but it could also regress into something from an earlier stage, but in a sort of inverted form. And so my question is like, for Althusser, right, does something like regression happen where the weakest link is not just on the um, the evil doers of history who are undermined by their bad side, but also the proletariat, or the example that he uses, the German Social Democrats, in which their bad side of the weakest link undermines them, and it seems to have this regressive formula in an overdetermined model, if that makes sense. I don't know what you all
It
think about
does.
that.
I
Yeah,
just want to say one quick thing, and then Conrad or others can jump in. There's a great question. If you read Slavoj Žižek's introduction to Mao's On Contradiction, I think it's published by Verso. Um, what I find it actually funny because Žižek almost kind of positivizes this notion of the bad side of history and this like formulates a type of psychoanalytic revolutionary ethics out of it, where it's always this kind of like uh, sense that the task is to intervene within the political field and um, to wager sort of at the site of um, I don't even call it the weakest link, but you have to just read this introduction to Mao's On Contradiction to get the sense of something very almost idiosyncratic that Slavoj develops out of that, which I myself am not convinced of it. I mean, I think for me, keep in mind that Althusser is a Lacanian. He's not so much a traditional Freudian. And that
absolutely.
is important because I recently gave a presentation on this. I was studying Althusser's reading of Lacan. And one of the things that Rancière really introduces a very, very well in his book, Althusser's Lesson, was that why did the PCF question Althusser's incorporation of Lacan? A lot of it, well, I think some sense falls down to what Rancière refers to as Althusser's kind of fatalistic embrace of this notion of the subject of subversion. In other words, there's this sense of a kind of non-Marxist, like trans-class theory of alienation that psychoanalysis gives vis-a-vis the imaginary, which I would even connect to this question, and I would love to know what Drew and Nicholas and some of these, we have some real Althusserian scholars in the house right now, what they make of this notion of the survivals at the very end of the essay, and how or how not that might be connected to psychoanalysis. Because I think that in some sense, Althusser's theory of the imaginary, in a Lacanian sense, gives us a sense that we also have with Zizek and other left Lacanians that alienation is kind of like um, transcends all of the Marxist categories. So, Conrad, I don't know if you have a quick comment on the
Yeah,
Freud point. Go ahead.
I have a quick comment on that. So, um, that is like, by the way, that is like, that's a, what a question. Wow. Uh, so really, really impressive. So that's a really hard question. And the reason that's a really hard question, as I would see it, and maybe there's some other people who have a different view, or maybe even a more elaborate understanding of this, as I would see it, is because Althusser's conception of temporality is never fully cashed out. In fact, if we want to look at the most developed treatment of that, I think in Reading Capital, Etienne Balibar, he attempts to develop a theory of transition based on the décalage or discordance of elements within the capitalist social formation, and introduces, or not introduces, but applies structuralist concepts like diachrony and synchrony to explain it. And that's widely considered to not have been completely successful. So one consequence of that, I think, is that when it comes to these questions about temporality, it can be difficult to provide a definitive answer. That having been said, I think that what we really get and what's maybe most important in practice from Althusser's reading with respect to temporality is the importance of synchrony itself. So Daniel just brought up the idea of survivals. What we see within Althusser is this rejection in general of the idea of the survival or the vestige, because what Althusser wants to argue is that rather than a kind of simplified model whereby, okay, this is the way the economy works and these things are just from the past, what we need to do is actually to develop and understand the relations between all of these things. And I think this is really, really important, by the way, today, not so much for analyzing like state communism, if you will, or anything like that, but because of the particular way that liberal ideology functions today. Because I think one thing we see very frequently is that, I actually write about this in the article I wrote recently, The Social Formation of the Far Right for Cosmonaut, which perhaps some of you read, I'm not sure. But one thing we see within liberal ideology is that there's an attempt to diminish or obfuscate features of our current structure, which are, which generate prejudice, right? By presenting them as questions of attitude. So I give the example in the essay of the way that Obama, when he implemented, the sort of Equal Pay Fairness Act, uh, he said, well, a lot of people, they think that the problem is, a lot of people, they think the problem is, women have families, they make excuses why women make less. It's not that. It's just some people are sexist and they pay women less. Well, look, like statistically, right? There's not a lot of evidence to support that, right? But what we do know, right? Like if you adjust for different factors, what you find is that wages between men and women are relatively equal. But what we do know is that women bear the vast majority of socially reproductive labor, right? So what you see here is that what is really the main cause, which is the family, is shunted to the side, and the problem is presented as one of attitude. And we see this all over. I mean, if you look at the exploitation of immigrant labor in the United States, if you look at the racialized character of the world market, right? There's an attempt to resolve this into, well, these people are bad races without, and that's connected to this idea of the survival, right? This idea that, oh, Trump is like this guy who wants to bring the 1950s back. I'm sorry, a lot of what Trump, the prejudice that he channels, is a direct reflection of where we are today and how the economy functions. So I think there's actually a great utility to this critique of the idea of the survival, and to the notion of synchrony as it functions within Althusser for our present now, right?
That's really good. It's somewhat paradoxical because on the one hand, there's a certain latent fatalism of the Lacanian theory of alienation as inescapable, which is, let us remind everyone, the axiomatic position of like a group like the Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis, right? Which is like, oh yeah, the big error of Marxists is to think that there's like some like these debates that Lukács stirred up of like, well, can we get beyond reification, right? They're like, no, no, no. Lacan teaches us that this is a fool's errand. I think that Althusser has that same psychoanalytic fatalism, in my opinion. Ishan, go ahead.
Yeah, my question had to do with the place of dialectic for Althusser. Uh, I recall reading he kind of brings up a particular characterization of Hegel again and again, that he moves from quantity to quality in the course of his dialectic. And that's sort of legitimate in Hegel because of the way he's sort of responding to a challenge posed in Kant that you don't have the categories themselves in Kant. He just sort of draws them from the received formal logic of the day. And part of Hegel's project then is to see how the movement of the consciousness and say in considering one category by necessity kind of brings you to a new category. The consideration of nothing gets you to being, the consideration of being gets you to unity, the consideration of unity gets you to plurality, and the whole motion like that. And it seemed to me Hegel could only again do this because Marx had done away with sort of self-consciousness, the egoistic self-consciousness. There's consciousness, but there's no ego after the first critique. And to that end, I thought it was quite valid what Althusser was doing, and because I mean we won't necessarily assent to these presuppositions that allow Hegel to do what he's doing. Then Althusser's extrication of Marxist dogmatic science from not dogmatic, scientific socialism from that sort of Hegelian thinking is valid in that sense. But what I was wondering was, is there anything of dialectic left after you've done away with this particular sort of movement? Is it just structuralism all the way down, as it seemed then? I mean, I recall reading in the Jacques Martin piece that a particular a particular innovation of Althusser was that he had moved the conception of the problematic from diachrony to synchrony once again, and this is something that then structuralism is sort of typical of. Even say Bakhtin's reading of Rabelais is completely synchronous, even in the sort of lead up to Rabelais that then sort of explains why Carnivalesque is a tendency that does away with the tensions of the day. I was just curious if anything of the dialectic is left, or is just structuralism all the way down in Althusser then?
So obviously, you know, there are elements of dialectic that still would be present within Althusser's work, right? So if we think of, the sensitivity to change, right, albeit conceived in a synchronic register, if we think of the importance of rupture from the standpoint of a certain reading. But I think in a sense you answered your own question, because I feel like once you privilege synchrony to that degree, you're not going to have anything
Yeah,
left resembling a conventional Hegelian dialectic. So, um, you know, but of course, it's important to remember that, Marx's formulation of dialectic is, profoundly different than Hegel's as well, right? I think in different hands, dialectic will have been subject to different historical transpositions. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't have a lot more to say though.
no. I think we have two special guests. I'd like to invite Dhruv to jump in. Who actually, I just want to say one thing before I introduce Dhruv. He, with Assad Haider, was actually one of the facilitators or serious participants of the very first study group that I put forward on a book called Anthropology of the Name by Sylvain Lazarus. And so, welcome. How are you? You on mute?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I remember that first reading group. It was fun. Yeah, you know what? I don't want to distract you all too much from what you guys are saying. I thought maybe I'd put a little bit of this book into context, right? I think that often people imagine this book as a book, but it's not a book. It's a collection of essays which are written over a period of time. So you have to think about it, and I think it's important to see the dates of the essay prior to it and the essay this one, right? So when what happens during that year? Um, in mid 1961, you have the last essay on the Hegelian dialectic, and then this actually only comes out in December of 1962. So basically, there's 18 months in which there's a gap in Althusser's writing, and I think it's important. So one of my so just so people know who I am, my name is Dhruv Jain. I'm a scholar of Maoism, Althusser, and Machiavelli. So I've got a book coming. I've published on Mao and the Maoist movement. I've published on Machiavelli, and I've got a book coming out next year, hopefully this year, on called Machiavelli at the Barricades, which is actually on Althusser's reading of Machiavelli from 1956 till his death. And so, what's really important is that what happens in that period between, because one of my major arguments is that 1962 January, like 1961 to this period, is a massive break for Althusser. It's a massive revelation. And what happens is in 1961 summer, Althusser goes to Italy. He comes back with two things. One is a new lover who sends him books, and the essay you can there's a his letters to her are published in French, and I actually refer to those letters. And then what happens after that is he comes back with a love for Machiavelli. Until 1961, basically, Althusser's attitude towards Machiavelli is incredibly negative. And that starts as early as his lectures from 56. And I think the other thing I think is really important to recast Althusser is that to remember that Althusser was not a research professor. He was a tutor and he was an administrator. So he's constantly teaching during this period, or he's doing administrative work. He is not a researcher, and he's not been hired as a researcher. Yeah. Well, so the in 61 he comes back with this new interest in Machiavelli, and in this January of 62, Althusser actually teaches the first course on Machiavelli, which is from, and so a major part of my book is a major part of my book is a close exegesis of the 1962 seminar on Machiavelli, where and so from 61 after or the later part of 61, you have Althusser reading Frederick the Great, you have Althusser reading Monin, and he basically reads the vast majority of available Machiavelli scholarship in French. So, and at the 1961 as well, which is really important from a Maoist perspective, is that you have the final opening of the break between the Soviets and you have the final sort of lobby in the 1961, December 1961, of the Sino-Soviet split. And so what do you have with like, for example, Conrad, you mentioned this kind of detached almost approach to Mao. And that's partly because Althusser at this point is trying to not avoid, is trying to avoid getting expelled from the party for taking a side which is pro Sino, but is not Maoist. And you have to remember, Althusser never became a Maoist. He was always pro-Chinese, but he was not a Maoist. And if anyone in the group is from India, the difference would be the CPM and the CPIML, right? There was that sort of fundamental understanding of how to understand Mao. So in 62, Althusser gives this series of lectures on Machiavelli, and then he never finishes the seminar because he has a mental breakdown. And the one thing that's also really important to remember about Althusser is throughout his life, there are large periods of time where he's in a sanatorium getting electroshock therapy. And so I think that is something that is, when people talk about 79 and stuff like that, I think it's really important that he has these real moments of medical collapse. And so in 62, in February, March, he has one of these collapses. And he's put into a sanatorium. And then he comes out of the sanatorium writing a new essay called Contradiction and Overdetermination. So I think that this is like this kind of interesting moment. And so if you see in the book, in the Contradiction Over Determination, there's the first time of two references. One major reference, which is to Machiavelli, where he puts Machiavelli and Mao and Lenin into this kind of structural and homology between the three. And what's interesting, and this goes back to what you were saying about Gramsci, is that in the letters to Macedonia, Francis, he writes that Gramsci has only understood Machiavelli in a historical, practical sense, and I've approached him from a theoretical perspective. And his fundamental criticism of Gramsci during this period is that Gramsci actually has no philosophy. He actually is only a political theorist. And so it's an interesting sort of take, and I think that's where Contradiction Over Determination starts with this idea, which is novel to the Machiavellian Althusser in a way that insofar that he introduces the concept of the void place. So if you look at and that starts from the last chapter of Machiavelli's The Prince, where he says that everything around Machiavelli is collapsed. It's a void, but it's a political void. And this is where Althusser is grabbing onto a book on ancient Greek thought. I'm forgetting the name of the book. I'll find it for you guys. But it basically shows that that Aristotle's thought. No, it's not Lucretius. It's a book of no. It's a book on ancient political thought from a structuralist perspective.
Is it
Anyways,
Vernant? Vernant?
yeah, I think it's Vernant's books. So in
Yeah.
Vernant's book, what he says is that basically the collapse of a particular kind of Macedonian principality allows for the emergence of thought. And basically what Althusser sees in Machiavelli is a similar structural homology there as well. And he sees the same thing from Marx and all of these, and Mao. And so this is where he's sort of creating these constellation of figures who he likes and then who he doesn't like. Anyways, I'll leave it there. I probably talked way too much. So there you go.
It's incredibly interesting, especially because last time we were talking about the limitations of biography, but here you've given us the strengths of Althusser's biography to precisely situate what's going on in this essay. It's really masterful. I think we want to follow up with you, Dhruv, on a few questions about Gramsci because he's come up before. If you could help us with that, but first, let's hear from Nicolas Villarreal, who's actually been on the Emancipations podcast and is a great comrade. and welcome. Please jump in.
Glad to be here. Thank you. I took some notes here, and I think the place I want to begin is in like if we were to think about how we would put like Hegelian dialectics into an operational Althusserian terms, what would that look like? And I think that it would basically look like Althusser saying like, okay, the inversion would be um, changing the raw material of dialectical logic, of the input into that, from concepts and into from like the abstract concepts and ideas into specifically material concepts, and transforming that particular raw material. And I think that the reason Althusser says that doesn't work is that the reason is because of the difference in those two types of raw materials. And you can't have the same type of logic operation working on them in the same way. Because, and I think this is actually a very consistent thread in Althusser. It's funny because I've actually approached him kind of in the opposite temporal direction. And I started with Philosophy of the Encounter, his ideology essay, and then moved to reading Capital and for Marx now. And what he says there in Philosophy of the Encounter is that there's you can't go from the logic of one encounter, and when it ends, you can't use that internal logic to extrapolate to how it'll be in the next encounter, how it is transformed. And in the ISA essay, talks about how there is no history of ideology. And that this is like that kind of history of ideology is one thing that Hegel is doing, is that he's extrapolating from the ideas of the past to see how they created the ideas of the present. And what Althusser is saying is that actually the ideas of the present aren't immanent in the ideas of the past. They are the result of certain of these ruptures, of these breaks caused by the specific properties of the material as a raw material. Because they have they can be unpredictable in a certain way. They don't have this necessarily immanent logic to them in the same way that Hegel's dialectics do. So, and this applies to a couple things. Like, for example, when we're talking about the last instance, and Thompson has the critique that that the last instance, what we can actually see the last instance of like economic phenomena impacting history. But what that he kind of misses is the way that Althusser is talking about what structures are. For example, in reading Capital, because Althusser is talking about structures as like emerging from empirical phenomena. So when we see an empirical economic phenomena impacting history, it is not the same as the theoretical concept of an economic structure shaping history, because what is happening is that that economic structure is being expressed through that empirical phenomena, and the theory only exists at the level of those structures and how they interact with each other. The theory doesn't exist on the level of empirical phenomena in terms of this particular type of Marxist theory, and really, and I think Althusser claims theory in general. And what he's like the reason this is so important for Althusser is because he's trying to critique this certain type of Stalinism that is using like this a simple, almost like vulgar dialectical logic, and applying it to like that phrase of Marx that cites here. He also cites it in on the reproduction of capitalism in like a footnote or something, talking about how like this why this particular logic of going from one technology to the next, a steam engine to whatever, is not determining in the way that like the simplistic extrapolation of Marx's statement would imply. Because if what he was confronted with was like that how this was used as a state ideology, right? Because that binary logic is broad enough that you can place anything into this opposition, right? Um, and once you are able to do that, you can effectively maneuver it in any which way you want. Whereas Althusser, because he's saying that structures are emergent from empirical phenomena, is like saying that you can't do that. You have to actually theorize structures independently of this logic. And then, because you're creating like the whole generalization, saying the whole raw material thing, you're taking that to create these theoretical structures and then operating on that. Whereas like the state ideologies are using these like simple logics to put things in whichever categories are most advantageous to them. And and this also applies to the issue with like history's bad side and like the Russian Revolution and what have you, and the master slave dialectic, because the reason you can't like it's not just adopting a new certain type of logic of like, okay, so this wasn't like you can't actually say that it's always the logic that you're not expecting, right? That's actually a contingent thing. Sometimes it will be the logic that you expect. Sometimes it will actually be the primary contradiction that matters, though not always. And that this is basically like the idea of like the surviving structures is also related to this. The fact that like that this kind of relates to how he's thinking of structures as like the way that empirical phenomena can move further away and closer to structures in time, that they're not always moving to become a certain structure. They can also move away from it. And the surviving structures are kind of an example of that, because there is like you can have encounters which definitively say this structural logic is ending, but that doesn't always have like be the case. And there's always these other structures in the background that are moving at their own pace alongside of that, I think is the idea. Of course, this is kind of like reading in some of the things that Althusser would later write. But I think this is like he was pretty consistent on this, I feel. In how this like how he used these ideas, at least from my perspective.
Excellent. And that kind of answers Ishan's question about dialectics too. And I felt like this point that you made was interesting, where you kind of referenced this notion of the hand mill that Marx uses as a vulgar theory about the relationship between base and superstructure in feudalism, and how this is ultimately a reductive theory of the contradiction that moves history. And yeah, but he's also saying that this is sort of what you get with Hegel. You get this almost unitary theory of contradiction. And I just feel that there's so much to Hegel that Althusser's almost sort of falsely boxing Hegel into a type of reductionism, which I don't feel like behooves the grandeur of Hegel. So it's quite easy, I think, for Hegelians to come back and kind of assault Althusser for some of those limitations, in my opinion. I wanted to actually ask a question about Gramsci, if I could. Um, and I don't know if anyone else had any points, but I was wondering, perhaps Dhruv or others could jump in on this. Gramsci seems to be a huge interlocutor in this particular essay. Can you say, Dhruv, a little bit more about that, insofar as um, a lot has been written about that, but how would you situate this influence of Gramsci? I mean, you had mentioned the Machiavelli point, but there's also this motif that I picked up on regarding the sort of, on the one hand, the embrace of the conjunctural analysis, the rejection of Gramsci's theory of the intellectual as somehow inadequate, and the idea that Gramsci has a certain awareness of the limitations of what he calls the moralism of mechanical determinism in the face of defeats, political defeats. What else do you get here
So,
from Gramsci?
so I think that I think it's worth, and I don't think I'm going to say something you're going to like. For Althusser, the thing that he will give Gramsci, and he says this repeatedly, is that after Marx, Engels, and Lenin, there was Gramsci. He basically says that what you would regard as the Western Marxist tradition, which would be Horsch, Lukács, and I'm forgetting who the third one is. Who's the third one that everyone puts together? The three of them are
Ernst Bloch, probably.
maybe Bloch, but probably Bloch. He basically says, look, this is actually not interesting. He says the next, he basically says that multiple times they have not asked any questions worth even discussing. And you have to remember at this time, and I've argued this to many people before, Althusser actually has not read much Adorno or Horkheimer. He has them on his bookshelf, but he actually has read very little. And if you're ever interested, you can I can actually look up for you how many books by Lukács. I mean, I have a full catalog of his library,
Well,
which is very useful.
he definitely studied history and class consciousness.
Yes, so he's read books, but
For sure.
but I'm trying, yeah, I'm not trying to deny that. I'm just trying to say that he didn't think that they were asking interesting questions. For him, what he will say about Gramsci is that Gramsci is the next meaningful political theorist, of a political philosopher after Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and he will grant that to Gramsci. So there's an appreciation there. But on the other side of it, he basically consistently throughout his career, and this goes all the way from, and I think that also it's worth remembering where Gramsci fits in the French political landscape. Gramsci at this time, by 1961, there's a group inside the PCF called the Italians, who are basically really inspired by Gramsci and Togliatti by this point. You have to remember by 19, 1 second, sorry, my daughter's, Navi, can I do this later, baby? My you have to, for Gramsci, like is basically adopted by the Togliatti, and you have to understand that at this point, Togliatti in 1961, if I remember, is basically arguing for the theory of pluriversality. So you can actually find polemics from the Sino-Soviet split called Comrade Togliatti and Us, and then a series of replies between the two parties. And I think it's really worth remembering that. So Althusser is working in this political context that there is a group inside the the French party, which is called the Italians, who are drawing on this tradition, and they're articulating those kinds of politics inside the party. So Althusser is actually dealing with, and so he's dealing with actually 2 to 3 different factions, which he actually fundamentally opposes. There's the dogmatic faction, which is very pro-Albanian. Then he is opposing within the pro-Mao faction, some of the Maoists, and then he's opposing the pro-Soviet types, and then he's criticizing the Italians. And this is the landscape in which, and so even in 1978, in his book which has now been translated, which is all about a response to Gramsci, many of the same arguments are made throughout his life. And I'm not trying to argue that Althusser and Gramsci cannot be reconciled in many ways, but I don't think they can be. I think you have to make a choice between Althusser and Gramsci.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I think that if you adopt a Gramsci, I think that Althusser's political, philosophical vision is completely opposed to that of Gramsci. Like I think that, and so so for Althusser, why he returns to Machiavelli is to say that I don't need Gramsci for Machiavelli. Machiavelli, just if you read Machiavelli himself, you will find conjunctural analysis. And so in many ways, what he's trying to do with Machiavelli is wrench him away from Gramsci to say actually, and so in the beginnings of this 1962 lecture, he basically argues that Gramsci is the modern manifestation of the Hegelian constitution, of Hegel's constitution of Germany. And he says it's basically this kind of unfolding history, and with a prince, as basically Napoleon on the horse. Althusser says, actually, if you look at what the prince is, and this is what he's saying about Lenin, and this is what he's saying about Mao. These are people from an unlikely place, an unknown name from an unlikely place at an unknown time, make a strike, and are able to, at a weak point in the contradiction, are able to have a revolutionary moment. And that's what he starts sort of saying that that's where you can see that in Machiavelli. And so there's this, and what he's pointing out, what you were mentioning, and I do want to say one thing, which is to correct you a bit, Daniel. He was never a Lacanian, too. I think it's really important that, too, because he was a follower of Dyatkin, and he made very sure that Dyatkin never followed one of the Lacanian schools. Dyatkin remained very much within the Freudian fold. And Althusser was appreciative of Lacan, especially some of his early lecture essays from 59 and 60, which is why Althusser brought him to come, but he never adopted Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he refused to be analyzed by Lacanians. He went very clearly to Dyatkin throughout his career and remained very much within that Freudian fold, but of a very specific kind of Andrew Green, of Green, which you can see in the Cahiers pour
Oh, Andre
analyse
Green.
debates. Yeah, so that was the kind of school that Althusser was much more comfortable with, and he was the Althusserian Lacanian tradition is one that you are definitely indebted to, which starts basically in the Cahiers pour analyse by students
So you
rather than
do you
Althusser.
are you saying then that's very interesting, thank you. Are you suggesting that the Althusserian Lacanian school have um maybe done a misreading, or they've exaggerated
Oh,
the
I think they have a different
influence?
master. I don't think Althusser is a master for the Althusserian Lacanian school. Basically, the master for the is actually one of Althusser's students, and it's that Cahiers pour analyse group that is
Yeah,
really the founders of the Althusserian Lacanian school,
right.
and that's where I would situate that rather than in Althusser. And that's the useful thing about Althusser is that you can have multiple sorts of post-Althusserianism. So Michel Pichot, for
Mm,
example, another one of his students, comes up with a
yes.
completely different
Yes.
form of and I think that that's the way to understand post-Althusserianism and his students is that there are differences. So there are some, like for example, you guys mentioned on the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was an essay that Balibar said I never wanted to write, but Althusser forced him to write it as
Ah,
part of a series of polemics that his students, many of his students from the pro-Soviet faction, of the PCF faction, went and wrote. So at this time, Bachelet has written, oh, no, not Bachelet. Pichot has, for example, written one. And so several of the students were doing this intervention at that time. But I think that, but anyways, what I'm trying to say is that the Gramsci, the interest in Gramsci is one of an appreciation that you were not, that you did something unique in Marxism, but it's also like, man, you got this all wrong.
mm,
I don't know.
thank you.
That's how I
Yeah, yeah.
take it.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Thank you so much. Well, I don't want to
On
keep
that, on
folks.
that, on that,
Go ahead.
I could just add that I think that, if we look at his, I mean, in one sense, right, there's this um, obvious influence of Gramsci, right, on Althusser, because we have, these the tremendous interest in ideology, right? Most notably, I think for many people in the ISA's essay, hegemony, culture, and so on. So I think a lot of the influence is apparent in what he's sort of thematizing. But if you look at his critique of Gramsci, which wasn't initially published, but now is Que faire, right? It's later published. One of the major points he makes, and I think this is, and maybe there are some people who know Gramsci better than I do who could elaborate on this a bit more. But one of the major points that he makes is that he accuses. So often we associate, you have this quote by Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson will say, "Always historicize," right? But what does it mean to historicize? That's an important question. Of course, Jameson is a tremendous Althusserian influence. And I think one of the differences Althusser really highlights is the fact that, in a sense, for Althusser, there is no history as such, right? So, what we term history right? It's always kind of ideological, the presentation, but you would have to resolve it at the level of, examination from the standpoint of the structures that Marx posits within his scientific break, right? So, social formation, mode of production, relations of production, and so on. And this comes up in Reading Capital, right? Where there's these attempts to kind of, penetrate and deconstruct, a more generic form of empiricist historicism. But I think one of the continual issues he has with Gramsci is the fact that, and of course, Drew was talking about the sense in which Gramsci would be residual alien, right? Is he treats history in too indiscriminate a manner on that level, that he doesn't adequately expose it, right, to the thread line of Marx's concepts. And this goes hand in hand with a larger critique of Gramsci, which is that, I think he finds within Gramsci, again, things are thematized for the first time within Marxism that we have to address. But also, Gramsci's work, it's too normative, right? It's too normative with respect to how history is conceptualized. It's also too normative with the way that he conceives revolutionary rupture, right? Acknowledges the possibility of, different kind of events taking place. We're talking about Bonapartism or sort of revolution from above. But he always kind of treats the, simplification of contradiction, the archetypal proletarian model, if you will, as the kind of absolute baseline against which all other expressions have to be measured, right? And so again, I think that we have, and there's a great essay by, I think, Morfino, right, on the Althusser Gramsci relationship. But I think on one hand we have this sense in which Althusser is trying to rewrite Gramsci, right, exploring territory that Gramsci introduced into the Marxist tradition, but also a sense in which he's going to find that Gramsci's explorations of these were inadequate to the subject matter that he'd introduced to that tradition. So that would be my attempt at kind of intervening in that.
Brilliant. I don't want to keep folks for too much longer. I tried to schedule these for about an hour and a half. We are over by 15, which is understandable given how vast and rich this material is. Really happy with the way this turned out tonight. I'm going to send out a revision for reading for next time. Dhruv and others want to put the Brecht essay back onto the reading agenda, which I think we should do. So Conrad and I will confer, and I'll send out a note tomorrow about what to read for next week. Are there any other sort of thoughts on this essay? I mean, I don't know if we've touched everything. We certainly could say a lot more about this.
By the way, Daniel, I won't be here next week, so I don't know.
You? Oh yeah.
I'll
Oh
be,
really?
I'll be in Venice for the Marx and the Anthropocene conference, the big thing going on there with John Bellamy Foster and Nancy Fraser and all that. So I won't be
Oh
here.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we will postpone. Let's confer about that and see where folks are at. Maybe that would give us a little more time to read, anyways. Yeah, take a week off would be fine. I do want to consider the Brecht essay for sure. But I mean, I do agree with the sort of this essay is something like a true rupture. It's very, very different than what we read in the Young Marx essay. How are folks that are early, like coming to Althusser for the first time? Did this make sense to you? Was this comprehensible? What remains of question for kind of people that are just first? I remember when I read this essay, it's a formidable work, in some sense. So no doubt. Although I mean it's formidable, but I also kind of I like the style in the sense that he's really, with the exception of section 2 on Lenin and 1917, which is kind of all over the place. The rest of the essay is like a pretty close exegesis on like a letter or a passage, which is kind of nice. Kolia, please jump in, and then Aliyah.
Yeah, thanks. I thought these were 2 hours, so I'm sorry that we're going over time here.
No worries.
I'm a little bit stunned by the question of whether Gramsci and Althusser's systems are salvageable as a unity or not. I don't know. I can't speak on that. But some other things have come up that I think I can speak on. I think this essay is an excellent addendum to a book that I have really been studying recently, which is Alan Shandro's Lenin and the Logic of Hegemony. Fantastic book. And I think that the question of the conjuncture, the question of overdetermination, and, Daniel, you brought up where does the merger formula fit here? If we only think of Marxism as kind of these general principles that through some pedagogical process we can teach the working class, when of course society is far more complicated. I think, one thing that the masses of people get right, they get a lot right. And one thing they get right is their appreciation of the complications. And the one thing they get wrong is, in the last instance, we're talking about the economic determination. I think Marxists get one thing right, and they get a lot wrong in the way that we engage in politics today as Marxists in the United States, to take our conjuncture. And I think what Althusser's framework gives us, and what I'm getting from Shandro's framework, is that the pedagogical process, which many people would agree comes through the political struggle, but that's too vague. I think the pedagogical process develops through the navigation of these complications by the proletariat and its intellectual representatives, however we want to put those pieces together. But it is this navigation of the complications that I think determines whether we will see an advancement of proletarian hegemony or an advancement of bourgeois hegemony at the point of this ruptural unity that Althusser talks about. And we can increase the importance of subjective actions, or we can emphasize the importance of the crisis. I think that's a debate, but we can't control the crisis. We can only control what we do subjectively. And I think I really like Zizek's, I haven't read that in a while, that intro to On Contradiction. I really like Zizek's idea that the wager has to be on the weakest link in the conjuncture. And I think that's one thing that I'm very, very interested in. How can we conceptualize the weakest link, our enemy's weakest link? And how can we conceptualize an alliance of class forces that point directly at the throat of our enemy? These are the questions I'm interested in. These are the questions that Shandro, I think, frames very well in his book. My speculative answer is that I think, we're overdetermined by things like the social movements, their real demands. One of these, is this movement against finance capital, Occupy Wall Street, the Bernie Sanders movement, which I think is reflected in the anti-racist movement and BLM. This purely parasitic finance capital that, above and beyond regular productive capital, sticks out of the conjuncture as something that everybody hates across classes. We can put together the kind of mass force of classes that Althusser mentions in this essay, I think, around this weak link of our enemy. I wonder what people think about that. That's kind of how I was reading this essay.
It's really good. I have a thought, and I invite others to jump in on that very rich intervention. I mean, part of this seems to me to suffer from a type of relativism insofar as if we take the anti-imperialist left, there's been a debate in recent times about what you might consider to be the almost like not mechanistic, or maybe moralism of some anti-imperialism, which is difficult, because I mean, I don't agree that the anti-imperialist left is un-Marxist or anti-Marxist, precisely in the sense that they refuse the primary contradiction between capital and labor, well, specifically within the core region, as a contradiction which would be eligible for our organizing, for our attention. They basically, in some cases, have determined that it is non-contradictory. That it's I mean, well, the distinction that Mao introduces between primary and secondary is certainly interesting here. It's not Althusser's language, of course, but I think that that haunts a lot of these questions. I think as it pertains to Zizek, part of the problem there falls into how a lot of the notion of the weakest link and the bad side of history is read vis-a-vis discourse. And so the problem actually becomes that a certain strain of Lacanian Althusserianism incorporates a theory of discourse and the subject of language, the subject of the unconscious. Yeah. And I think Drew's point that Althusser is not a Lacanian should not be seen or read as a strident claim that he's not a Lacanian. Because again, I'm not let me just correct my point. I'm not thinking that he's a doctrinaire Lacanian in terms of how he practices therapeutics or psychoanalytic practice. I'm simply saying that there's certain theories of alienation that Lacan, for example, why does Althusser develop his own theory of the four discourses? Why does Althusser say in a letter to Lacan that his conception of imaginary subjection touches something that even us Marxists cannot even fathom, and that social revolution cannot even touch, right? That doesn't necessarily qualify him as Lacanian in a doctrinaire dogmatic sense, but what it does show is that there's a huge influence of Lacan there that I think is undeniable. And so that's another question that I have for me. Like, okay, so then you have so obviously Zizek in 2016 chose the bad side, right? Of let's go all in on Trump, yeah. And to a certain extent, and people can call that accelerationist. But again, I'm not sure what I'm worried about is the how far you want to go afield. If we take this Zizekian discourse left Lacanian mumbo jumbo, the problem is that they're so far afield from productive, from a grounding in productive relations, in my view, in their theory of subjectivity itself. It's fully subtracted in discourse, that I do think you get a kind of relativism of the theorization of what qualifies as the bad side within our political conjuncture. You see my point? So it has to, therefore, in my view, be balanced with something of a institutional, organizational, and productive-based theory of the collective situation that we find ourselves in, which I think your point about finance capital stands out as very interesting to me. But that all depends on how you want to take it, because there's right-wing populist solutions to that. One of the tragedies of the post-BLM left is, yeah, we have kind of moved away from, I mean, this is sort of one of the problems and the tragedies of imperialism as Lenin discussed it, right? Which is that in ages of imperialism, one of the primary consequences is the reverberation of the incapacity of the domestic class struggle. The domestic class struggle becomes fractured in imperialist situation. So anyways, those are some just immediately responses to what you had to say, Kolia, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are. Then we can go to Aaliyah. Oh, yeah, or
I
Aaliyah
think,
immediately. Or
or
Conrad, yeah.
can I just go hop in quick? So, yeah, I think you're just to say, I think you're completely correct about the lack of rootedness in the kind of negative ontology, right, or ontology of the lack that we find within somebody like Zizek, which is not to say that it doesn't produce occasionally illustrious philosophical results. But again, I related this in an earlier talk to the you know, and as sure as there's a kind of primacy of rupture in Althusser to the way that Lacan had spoken ambivalently about the possibility of his own ontologization, right? And much as, you know, Lacan sought to keep, in a sense, the focus on psychoanalytical method, I think Althusser is trying to keep the focus as well, right, on a kind of Marxist method. Now, about anti-imperialism, about your comments, I think that this charge of moralism with respect to, advocates of anti-imperialism, in addition to just being, I think, kind of cynical and reflective of a kind of deep-seated incapacity of Marxists in the West to distance themselves appropriately from these processes. I think part of it is happening precisely because, in spite of these formidable efforts by Althusser and others, I don't think that there's ever really been a sufficient rethinking of Marx's methodology to accommodate sort of the unteleological outcomes of the 20th century in a way that's ever garnered a kind of full acceptance, right? And I think again, Althusserianism was a very notable project driving in that direction, but it's not ultimately a project that, for a range of reasons, uh, succeeds in the way that it had sort of hoped to. Right. And I think we see this today, certainly in the English world. And I already addressed at the outset, right, that I think that, Althusser is, the subject of a great deal of derision and dismissal. But it's interesting, right? Like, because we even see this, and this is to say, I think this is what leads people into this moralism, right? Because they understand that something wrong within, this sort of teleological understanding of Marxism, or even the sort of drift into a kind of left liberal standpoint that we can associate with Western Marxism to some extent. But they don't have like a strong methodological basis to articulate that. By the way, I want to go to Aaliyah in a second, so I don't want to take too much time here. And I think that's kind of what leads people into moralism. But we see this even within somebody like Losordo, right? To a point, I feel, where if you look at something like, I really want to, I wanted to say about this, I think we've been doing Lasordo, so I think it actually very useful to read Lasordo with Althusser. And I think we see this in Class Struggle, right? The book, or is it Class Struggles, plural? In which, and I argue that, of course, the problem with this book, in a sense, is that there's too much of a foreclosure of class struggle into the state, but he highlights all of the different processes going on, right? The need to not resort to a kind of simple teleology, right? To understand, women's struggle, colonial struggle, and all these different things. And that's very, very close to Althusser's gesture here, right? But I also think that, and we know that Husserl often has this sort of these different critiques of Althusser, which often amount to a kind of abuse. He'll say like, well, third world struggles were humanist, and Althusser kind of missed the boat or something, right? Um, but I think that while there is a resemblance, I think that often we see was sort of regressing into, a kind of a methodology which is kind of sub-Althusserian in terms of its sophistication. So I think it's a good example, right? Obviously, it's not like, a kind of simplistic moralism, right? Losordo's a reasonably sophisticated thinker in his own light, but it's an example of the kind of problem we're describing here. Hopefully, we can go to Aaliyah now.
Yes, are you still there, Aaliyah? I think she had to leave, unfortunately, which is unfortunate. I was looking forward to her comments. It's very helpful. I mean, this has been great. Yeah, I say an hour and a half, but we go to 2. But I mean, I also, to Kolya's point, I like to be a little bit more punctual. We pack in a lot, and it's a lot of material for folks, but it's extremely, extremely rich and beneficial. And I'm really stoked that we have so much interest in this group. Want to just say one final invite for folks that haven't commented. I know Philip saying things in the chat. If there's any final comments, I totally welcome them. If not, we'll definitely close. Conrad, where is your conference again? Italy?
Venice. Yeah.
Amazing. Oh my God. Wow. Wow.
It's a nice one. Yeah, it's actually funny if you ever go to Venice, it resembles Istanbul a little bit because during the Crusades, they actually took like the marble pillars and actually brought them over to Venice. So there's a kind of architectural resemblance you can notice.
I've only been there once. Yeah, it was amazing. Well, comrades, thanks everyone for your interventions. Thanks, Conrad, for co-leading this session. It's a really, really important essay. It's very challenging. And yeah, onward and upward. I think we will be in touch. on Patreon and on Discord with next steps. Thanks everyone for your time and attention. All the best.